I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
And Mark Lowcock for this year's last briefing on the situation in Syria. Distinguished colleagues, in 2 days' time, on the 18th of December, Security Council Resolution 2254 will mark its 5th anniversary. What result do we see at that date? What has been done by our Western colleagues to foster a political settlement in Syria? Let us recall that in 2015, Western countries still pinned their hopes on an overthrow of the legitimate Syrian authorities by force at the hands of bandits and terrorists. They were supplied with money and weapons, they were trained, they received direct military support from external players. They were taught how to wage a media propaganda and filmed staged videos and did their own rebranding. Damascus saw the imposition of sanctions in order to weaken the capacity of the Syrian army to repel the terrorist threat, despite the fact that terrorism threatened the whole region with catastrophe. They sought to carve up the country literally into pieces. Russia, on the request of the Syrian government, engaged with counterterrorism efforts. Ultimately, the carcass of international terrorism in Syria was destroyed. Terrorists have only dug in Idlib now, and they are also active in the northeast of Syria. Our Western colleagues are actively involved in rebranding them. Often they try and present them as a real political alternative to the authorities of Syria. The country has basically seen a ceasefire hold. Thanks to the Russian Center on the Reconciliation of Opposing Sides, it has been possible to stamp out intra-Syrian clashes. Thus, with our support, the Syrian statehood and the bodies in Syria have been preserved and services have been provided to the population in a situation of protracted conflict, with a decisive contribution made by Russia, Turkey and Iran as part of the Astana format and based on a decision of the Syrian National Dialogue Congress in Sochi in 2018, a constitutional committee was set up. This is the only format for dialogue where the Syrians themselves discuss the future of their own country. We welcome the holding of the 4th round of its drafting committee. As the special envoy said, the Syrians adopted a constructive approach and agreed upon a timeframe and agenda for the 5th session. This political dialogue could have started a year earlier if there had been no direct interference from a number of Western countries who clearly showed that a peaceful settlement in Syria is something they're not interested in. All the details of this saga is well known to members of the Security Council. So what do we see today in terms of Western states? Well, they still violate the very first paragraph of Security Council Resolution 2254, the respect for the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of Syria. After the failed attempt to overthrow by force yet another rogue government, our colleagues moved on to financial economic suffocation tactics. However, after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2254, these sanctions were actually expanded. One can hardly call that assisting the political process. Something else running counter to 2254 is the US occupation of part of Syrian territory and the attempt on an ethnic and faith-based basis to conduct yet another separatist experiment in the Middle East. The US is also directly responsible for the deterioration of the environment from the plundering of national oil resources and for other problems. There has been an increase in diseases, including cancers, amongst the people in that territory. We also see those leaving ISIL from sleeper cells going on rampages. In the Alcohol camp in the northeast and in Rukban, many people have been suffering for many years, but because of the US position, these problems are not solved. Our colleagues, the penholders of the humanitarian issues, for some reason don't seem to be paying any attention to this human suffering. Mr. President, Russia has done and is doing all it can to promote a peaceful settlement in Syria. However, each step it encounters opposition from the West. Even the chemical weapons issue, where a unique shared success was achieved, namely the eradication of chemical stockpiles in Syria, well, at the hands of our colleagues, this just became a form of pressure on the lawful authorities. The recent Security Council meeting, where the OPCW Director General was answering to question, confirms this. We are trying to decrease the politicization and improve the humanitarian aspect of the situation in Syria. Despite opposition from Western countries, we're striving to assist in interactions between the US and Damascus to provide humanitarian assistance to all Syrians, once again in line with Resolution 2254. Life in liberated areas is returning to normal. This is prompting rather more Syrian refugees to return home. According to the Russian Center for the Reconciliation of Opposing Sides, in total from September 2015, the country saw the return of more than 860,000 people. It's also clear that a further 1.2 million Syrians have stated their desire to return home. In November, in Damascus, with the assistance of Russia, an international conference on the return of refugees was held. Despite strong opposition and scare tactics from Western colleagues, people represented from more than 20 countries and international organizations, and this confirmed the importance of the international community concentrating efforts in this area. In this context, the issue of the provision of international assistance to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure of Syria is extremely important. We frequently have heard in the UN Security Council the harsh stance of our Western colleagues regarding conditions for providing such assistance. De facto, this constitutes a requirement for the Syrian authorities to remake the country's state structure in the mold of its donors. In other words, instead of improving the suffering of people, namely women and children, Syria is having political impositions upon it. And there is an increase in sanctions pressure as well. Mr. President, I would just like to talk about this particular topic in a bit more detail. On the 10th of December, the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of sanctions on human rights, Ms. Dovgan, put forward an anti-sanctions guidelines for the COVID-19 period. This document was a result of a 2-day brainstorming exercise which Ms. Dovgan held in October with 24 major humanitarian organizations. I would just like to quote some of the concerns from humanitarian workers that they have about sanctions. Unilateral sanctions are a key barrier in providing humanitarian assistance, including in providing delivery of medications, PPE, foodstuffs, and basic necessity goods. Unilateral restrictions are multifaceted, they're complicated, they're not transparent, and they represent a disjointed system. Humanitarian exemptions are not effective and not appropriate. End of quote. Distinguished Western colleagues, how do you respond to the fact that your sanctions efforts seem to be completely immoral? And you're putting all of the Syrian problems on the so-called Assad regime. We would like to point out that Russian servicemen who are in Syria on the invitation of the lawful government on an almost daily basis provide food assistance, are involved in rebuilding civilian infrastructure, and this work is going to continue. Mr. President, in conclusion, once again, I'd like to raise the question of the humanitarian convoy in Idlib across the contact lines. We deem it totally unacceptable that there's been no solution to this issue. We are not satisfied with the passive role of the UN and the hackneyed talk about coronavirus and the 8-month-long negotiations to agree upon modalities for the convoy. The silence of the proponents of the cross-border mechanism and a lack of appropriate discussion from those forces that are not allowing the convoy is also baffling. Reports on the humanitarian situation in Syria clearly state that Damascus is upholding its responsibility to provide humanitarian assistance on a non-discriminatory basis across the contact lines to all parts of this country. What kind of assistance that OCHA is talking about here? Perhaps you don't like it, but you can put forward various political games, but the facts speak for themselves. The situation in Syria has changed and it's never going to go back to its conflict past. I'd like to use this opportunity to state very seriously the following: a lack of progress in establishing not one-off but regular supplies of humanitarian assistance to Idlib across the contact lines will cause unjustified harm to the cross-border mechanism that has been extended to 2021. Thank you very much indeed.